You'd think a lion, sitting on top of the food chain, would happily eat anything smaller and weaker than itself, including other predators. Here's the uncomfortable part. Lions almost never eat other carnivores, even when they kill them, and the reason has almost nothing to do with taste and almost everything to do with a brutal calculation most people never think about. So let's actually ask the question properly. Why would a predator, an animal whose entire survival depends on successfully killing and consuming other creatures, go out of its way to kill a rival predator and then simply walk away from a fresh available meal? Because the honest answer isn't laziness or disgust or some kind of professional courtesy between apex hunters. It's a genuinely calculated risk assessment, one that plays out the same basic way across an enormous range of unrelated predator species. Let's start with the most immediate and measurable factor: energy expenditure versus energy return. Killing another predator is almost always significantly more dangerous and more physically costly than killing typical prey. Prey animals, herbivores especially, have evolved primarily around fleeing rather than fighting, meaning a successful hunt usually ends with the prey either escaping cleanly or being subdued relatively quickly with comparatively survivable risk to the predator. Another predator, by contrast, is built with the exact same weapons, the exact same combat instincts, and the exact same willingness to fight back with lethal intent. A confrontation between two predators frequently results in serious injury even for the winner: torn muscle, broken teeth, deep puncture wounds, injuries that in the wild carry genuinely severe consequences since an injured predator hunts less effectively, which directly threatens its ability to feed itself and any dependent offspring in the near future. Having already absorbed that cost simply to win the fight, actually eating the body provides comparatively little additional benefit relative to the risk already taken, especially when a genuinely accessible, lower-risk meal might be found elsewhere with far less physical cost. This dynamic has a specific, well-documented name in ecological research: Intraguild predation, referring specifically to predators killing other predators that occupy a similar ecological niche, competing for the same prey base. Researchers studying intraguild predation across large carnivore populations, particularly among Africa's major predator species, have documented this pattern extensively. Lions killing hyenas represents one of the most thoroughly studied examples, and researchers observing these interactions have consistently noted that lions overwhelmingly kill hyenas during direct territorial and resource conflicts rather than as a hunting strategy, and post-kill consumption is rare enough that researchers specifically flag it as a notable exception when it does occur, rather than treating it as expected behavior. Similarly documented patterns show up in North American wolf populations killing coyotes, another classic intraguild predation relationship where wolves frequently kill coyotes specifically to reduce competition for shared prey within overlapping territory, again with consumption of the coyote's body being the clear exception rather than the rule. There's a second genuinely important factor worth examining separately because it moves beyond simple risk versus reward and into something closer to hard biological necessity: the accumulation of toxins and parasites specifically concentrated in carnivore tissue. This concept, sometimes referred to by researchers studying trophic ecology as biomagnification, describes how certain toxins and heavy metals become increasingly concentrated as you move up the food chain, since each predator effectively absorbs and retains a portion of everything its prey has already accumulated throughout its own diet. An herbivore accumulates a relatively modest toxin load from the plants it eats. A predator that eats that herbivore accumulates a meaningfully higher concentration, since it's consuming the herbivore's already concentrated toxin load on top of whatever additional exposure it picks up itself. A predator that eats another predator, however, is consuming an animal that has already been through this same concentration process at least once, meaning the resulting toxin load in that second predator's tissue can be substantially higher again, sometimes reaching levels that pose genuine, measurable health risks even to another apex predator perfectly capable of handling normal prey without issue. It's worth walking through a concrete example of exactly how this concentration process compounds, because the math genuinely illustrates why the risk grows so dramatically at each additional trophic level. Researchers studying environmental toxin accumulation, mercury being one of the most extensively documented examples across food chains generally, have found that concentration can increase by a meaningful multiple at each successive step up the food chain, meaning an apex predator sitting at the very top of a food chain that includes another predator as prey can end up with toxin concentrations dramatically higher, sometimes by an order of magnitude or more, than an herbivore living in the exact same environment. This is precisely why environmental health advisories around mercury contamination, for instance, specifically warn about large predatory fish rather than smaller herbivorous species living in the same contaminated waters. The same fundamental biomagnification principle applies just as directly to a lion, considering whether to eat a hyena as it does to a human. Considering how much tuna is safe to eat regularly. This connects directly to something researchers studying predator health have documented repeatedly: elevated parasite loads specifically associated with carnivore tissue. Many parasites that infect predator species are specifically adapted to that particular predator's biology, meaning a parasite well-suited to surviving inside a wolf, for instance, may pose a considerably more serious infection risk to another wolf or a closely related predator species than it ever would to an herbivore the wolf might otherwise hunt. Predator tissue, in other words, isn't just potentially more toxin-laden, it's also frequently a more concentrated and more compatible vector for parasites specifically dangerous to other predators, creating a second, independent biological incentive to avoid consumption beyond simple energy economics. It's worth pulling apart a genuinely important related concept here: prion diseases, because this represents one of the most extreme, most well-documented examples of exactly why eating another predator can carry serious risk. Prions are misfolded proteins capable of triggering catastrophic, always fatal neurological damage in animals that consume infected tissue, and critically, prion diseases show a strong tendency to spread most effectively within the same or closely related species, a pattern researchers refer to as the species barrier. This means predators eating members of their own species, or closely related predator species, face meaningfully elevated risk of prion transmission compared to predators sticking to genetically distant prey. Chronic wasting disease in deer populations and documented prion-related conditions in various other species have given researchers substantial real-world evidence for exactly this pattern, reinforcing why evolution appears to have selected fairly strongly against habitual consumption of closely related species across numerous predator lineages. This raises a genuinely important distinction worth exploring directly: the difference between eating a different predator species and eating a member of your own species entirely, cannibalism. The species barrier effect we just discussed applies most powerfully to genetically similar animals, meaning cannibalism represents, in many respects, the single riskiest possible version of this entire pattern, since a same-species pathogen or prion faces essentially zero biological barrier to successful transmission. Researchers studying cannibalism across the animal kingdom have found it does occur in various predator species, but almost exclusively under conditions of extreme resource scarcity or in very specific reproductive contexts, and even then it correlates with measurably elevated disease transmission risk within affected populations compared to populations where cannibalism remains rare. This reinforces the broader pattern we've established, that genetic similarity between predator and prey directly predicts elevated biological risk, with same-species consumption representing the most extreme end of that same continuous risk spectrum, not some entirely separate category of behavior. Disease transmission more broadly follows this same basic logic even beyond prions and cannibalism specifically. A pathogen that has successfully evolved to infect one predator species is, almost by definition, already well adapted to predator physiology in general, meaning it frequently poses a considerably higher transmission risk to another predator than it would to a herbivore whose physiology is fundamentally different from the infected animals. Researchers studying disease ecology have found that closely related species consuming each other's tissue represents one of the most efficient possible pathways for pathogen transmission across an entire population, essentially removing several of the biological barriers that would otherwise limit a disease's spread. There's also a genuinely important behavioral and territorial dimension worth examining separately from the biological risk factors we've covered so far. Many predator-on-predator killings aren't actually motivated by hunting or feeding intent at all. They're motivated by territorial defense, competition over mates, or the elimination of a direct threat to an individual's offspring. Lions killing leopards, or wolves killing coyotes, frequently occur specifically because the smaller predator represents ongoing competition for the same limited prey resources within a shared territory, or a direct threat to vulnerable cubs and pups. In these cases, the killing itself accomplishes the actual underlying evolutionary goal: removing a competitor or eliminating a threat, completely independent of whether the body ever gets eaten afterward. Once that specific goal has been achieved, there's often no additional evolutionary incentive driving consumption at all, since the entire point of the encounter was competitive elimination rather than feeding in the first place. It's worth being genuinely precise here, because this pattern isn't absolute across every predator species in every circumstance, and painting it as a universal law would be misleading. There are documented exceptions where predators do consume consume other predators under specific conditions, most commonly during periods of extreme food scarcity, where the immediate caloric need becomes urgent enough to outweigh the accumulated toxin, parasite, and disease risks we've discussed. Researchers studying predator diets during severe famine conditions or extreme habitat disruption have documented increased instances of carnivore-on-carnivore consumption, specifically during these crisis periods, reinforcing that this isn't some fixed, unbreakable biological rule, but rather a risk calculation that shifts meaningfully depending on the alternative options genuinely available to that specific predator at that specific moment. There's a particularly interesting nuance worth exploring specifically around scavenging versus active predation in this context, because the calculation shifts somewhat depending on which category a given feeding opportunity falls into. A predator that stumbles upon an already dead carcass of another predator, rather than one it killed itself in direct competition, faces a somewhat different risk profile, since active recent infection or extremely high, freshly accumulated toxin concentrations may be less certain in an animal that died from other causes rather than one killed specifically during a violent confrontation. Even so, researchers studying scavenging behavior have found that most predator species still show a measurable preference for herbivore carcasses over predator carcasses when both are genuinely available, suggesting the underlying toxin and disease risk calculation continues to influence behavior, even in pure scavenging contexts, just somewhat less absolutely than in direct kill situations. This raises a genuinely interesting comparative question worth addressing directly. Why do some scavenger species, vultures and hyenas among the most notable examples we've covered in earlier videos on this channel, seem far more willing to consume a broader range of carcasses, including those of other predators, compared to species like lions or wolves? The answer connects directly back to concepts we've already established. These particular scavenger species have evolved genuinely extreme, specifically adapted digestive and immune defenses, extraordinarily acidic stomach environments, specialized gut microbiomes, and heightened immune responses. Precisely the kind of biological toolkit that would meaningfully offset the elevated toxin and pathogen risks associated with consuming predator tissue in the first place. Lions and wolves, by contrast, never evolved this same level of extreme digestive specialization, since their primary ecological role centers on active hunting of herbivore prey, rather than opportunistic consumption of already decomposing, potentially toxin-laden carcasses, meaning they simply never developed the same biological safety net that would make eating another predator's body a genuinely low-risk proposition the way it is for a vulture. There's also a broader ecological function worth acknowledging here, because this pattern of predator avoidance of predator consumption plays a genuinely important structural role in how ecosystems maintain balance. If apex predators regularly and efficiently consumed each other, it would create a considerably more volatile, boom-and-bust predator population dynamic, since successful predators would be directly incentivized to actively hunt down and consume their own competition as a primary food source, rather than the more common pattern where predator populations are regulated primarily by available prey density and territorial carrying capacity. Researchers studying predator population ecology have noted that the relative rarity of predator-on-predator consumption, despite the frequency of predator-on-predator killing for territorial and competitive reasons, likely contributes to more stable, predictable ecosystem dynamics than would otherwise emerge if apex predators treated each other as a routine, reliable food source. There's a genuinely interesting human parallel worth drawing here, because the underlying logic isn't nearly as foreign to human experience as it might initially seem. Human dietary guidelines specifically warn against regularly eating large predatory fish in high quantities, precisely because of the exact same biomagnification principle driving predator avoidance throughout the rest of the animal kingdom. Mercury and other environmental toxins concentrate more heavily the higher up the food chain a given fish sits. In a very real sense, when a nutritionist advises limiting swordfish or shark consumption specifically because of elevated mercury levels, they're applying the exact same core biological principle that quietly governs why a lion walks away from a dead hyena, recognizing that meat sitting further up a food chain carries meaningfully elevated risk, regardless of how appealing or accessible that meat might otherwise appear. So the picture that emerges here isn't really about predators being somehow squeamish, wasteful, or engaging in some kind of unspoken code of honor between apex hunters. It's about an extraordinarily specific, cumulative risk calculation: elevated physical danger during the confrontation itself, biomagnified toxin concentration in predator tissue, elevated parasite and pathogen compatibility risk specific to closely related species, an even more extreme version of that same risk in cases of same-species cannibalism, and, frequently, a killing motivation rooted in territorial or competitive elimination rather than feeding in the first place, all combining to make consuming another predator's body a genuinely poor evolutionary bet in the overwhelming majority of circumstances. One that only shifts when genuine desperation makes the alternative, starvation, an even worse option by comparison. So the next time you see footage of a lion killing a hyena, or a leopard killing a jackal, and walking away from the body without eating it, it's worth resisting the instinct to read that as waste, mercy, or some kind of predator etiquette. What you're actually watching is a remarkably consistent, remarkably rational risk management decision, one shaped by toxins, parasites, disease, and physical danger, all quietly running beneath the surface of a moment that, on the surface, looks like nothing more than one animal simply choosing not to eat a meal that was sitting right in front of it, and one that, in a strange way, follows exactly the same basic logic your own dinner plate quietly follows every time you think twice about how much swordfish is really worth eating.